The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union lasted from 1945 to 1991, with the United States emerging as the victor. However, what if the Soviet Union had won the Cold War? Alternate history scenario, we will explore how the Soviet Union could have gained leverage on the West and dominated the world stage through diplomacy. In the aftermath of World War II, the Soviet Union began expanding its influence in Eastern Europe, pushing communist governments in countries such as Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. The United States responded with the Marshall Plan, which provided aid to Western Europe to rebuild its economy. The two superpowers engaged in a global arms race, attempting to outdo each other in military and technological advancements. However, in this alternate history scenario, the Soviet Union gained a leverage on the West through economic means. In 1945, the United States had a gross domestic product, GDP, of $224 billion, while the Soviet Union had a GDP of only $76 billion. By 1950, the United States had a GDP of $319 billion, while the Soviet Union had a GDP of $126 billion. However, in this alternate scenario, the Soviet Union implemented successful economic policies, leading to a rapid increase in its GDP. By the late 1940s, the Soviet Union had already established a communist government in East Germany. However, in this alternate scenario, the Soviet Union was able to use diplomacy to turn West Germany communist. In 1953, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin died, and his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, implemented a series of reforms known as de-Stalinization, which resulted in a less oppressive government and greater freedom of speech. Khrushchev was also more willing to negotiate with the West, leading to a greater degree of trust between the two superpowers. In 1950, the Korean War began, with North Korea invading South Korea. In this alternate scenario, the Soviet Union was able to achieve a total victory in the Korean War, with North Korea taking over South Korea and establishing a communist government. This victory was due in part to the Soviet Union's successful economic policies, which allowed for a greater degree of military and technological advancement. With West Germany turning communist and the Soviet Union achieving a total victory in the Korean War, communism gained greater support in many countries around the world. The domino effect led to the establishment of communist governments in countries such as France, Italy, and Japan. The United States, faced with the rise of communism and economic challenges at home, was unable to prevent the Soviet Union's dominance on the world stage. In the alternate history scenario where the Soviet Union won the Cold War, the 1960s would have been a time of turmoil in the United States.
I have a dream. My four little children one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
The Soviet Union's dominance on the world stage would have led to an increase in communist sympathizers in the U.S., particularly among the youth and minority groups who were disillusioned with the government's handling of civil rights in the Vietnam War. In the 1964 presidential election, the two major candidates would have been Gus Hall, the leader of the Communist Party USA,
were proposed by the North Vietnamese even before Nixon was elected president,
and George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, known for his segregationist policies.
And if I were the president of the United States, I would take whatever was necessary to prevent what happened in this city if we had the order the knocking in the head of many people. And when you do that, you're going to satisfy the overwhelming majority of people of all races in this country, because it's not a matter of race. It's a matter of anarchists, and the government has kowtowed to every anarchist group in the United States.
Robert Kennedy, the younger brother of former President John F. Kennedy, would have run as a third-party candidate representing a more moderate stance. Protests over the Vietnam War would have intensified, with many calling for an end to the conflict and a re-evaluation of U.S. foreign policy. These protests would have eventually turned violent, leading to a breakdown in the government structure and the possibility of a revolution. Just like the recent storming of the Capitol in 2021, the Soviet Union could have used this opportunity to destabilize the U.S. government and increase its own influence in the region. In this alternate scenario, the Soviet Union would have also used China as a proxy to stop the Sino-Soviet split and overthrow Mao Zedong. With China under Soviet control, the two countries would have reunited North and South Korea under a communist government. Additionally, the Soviet Union would have won the Vietnam War through tactical numbers alone, as the U.S. government would have been too distracted by internal turmoil to commit significant resources to the conflict. The victory in Vietnam would have further increased the Soviet Union's global influence, leading to more countries aligning with communism and greater resistance to U.S. foreign policy. The Soviet Union's domination on the world stage would have continued well into the 21st century, shaping the course of history in ways that are impossible to predict. The 1970s would have been a time of further turmoil in the U.S. government. With protests and violence continuing to escalate, the government would have been forced to make significant changes to its policies and structures. In the 1972 presidential election, the first communist president would have been elected, elected, marking a major shift in U.S. politics. The new administration would have pursued policies that were more aligned with the Soviet Union and other communist countries, leading to greater cooperation and solidarity among leftist movements around the world. In this alternate scenario, the Soviet Union would have also facilitated a communist reunification of Germany, leading to the creation of a new socialist state that would have become a major player in European politics. The Soviet system itself would have undergone liberalization, with greater emphasis on individual rights and decentralization away from Russia and towards China and the now communist USA. As the Soviet Union and its allies gained more power and influence, there would have been communist uprisings in third world countries throughout the 1970s. These uprisings would have been fueled by a combination of factors, including poverty, inequality, and the perception that capitalist countries were exploiting and oppressing their citizens. The turmoil in the U.S. government and the rise of communist movements around the world would have also led to the overthrow of the British monarchy, as the UK struggled to maintain its global influence and relevance in a world dominated by communist powers. The UK would have become a socialist republic, aligning itself with the Soviet Union and other communist countries. In conclusion, the alternate scenario where the Soviet Union won the Cold War would have led to significant changes in global politics and power dynamics. The 1970s would have been a time of further turmoil in the U.S. government, the election of the first communist president, and the overthrow of the British monarchy. The Soviet Union would have facilitated a communist reunification of Germany, liberalized its own system, and decentralized power away from Russia towards China.
Alright, so 3, 2, 1, and scammer gets scammed, buddy. That's what you get. You're not getting our guns back. No.
And the now communist USA. Communist uprisings would have occurred in third world countries throughout the decade, further fueling the rise of leftist movements around the world. The differences between the alternate timeline where the Soviet Union won the Cold War and our timeline would be significant and far-reaching. To start, let's compare some key economic statistics from 1945, the year the war ended. GDP. In 1945, the U.S. had a GDP of $227.8 billion, while the Soviet Union had a GDP of $163.8 billion. In the alternate timeline, the Soviet Union would have gained significant leverage on the West, likely resulting in a redistribution of wealth and power between the two superpowers. Military spending. In 1945, the U.S. spent $59.7 billion on military expenditures, while the Soviet Union spent $28.8 billion. In the alternate timeline, the Soviet Union's victory in the Cold War would have likely resulted in a significant increase in military spending as it consolidated its power and sought to maintain its dominance over the world stage. Moving on to the 1960s, here are some statistics that highlight the differences between the alternate timeline and our timeline. Presidential election. In our timeline, the 1968 presidential election saw Republican Richard Nixon defeat Democrat Hubert Humphrey. In the alternate timeline, it's likely that the Communist Party candidate Gus Hall would have run against segregationist George Wallace, with a third-party candidate like Robert Kennedy also in the mix. Protests and social unrest. In our timeline, the 1960s were marked by protests and social unrest over issues like civil rights and the Vietnam War. In the alternate timeline, these protests would have been even more intense and widespread, potentially resulting in the overthrow of the U.S. government's structure. Vietnam War. In our timeline, the U.S. was unable to win the Vietnam War, despite committing significant resources and manpower to the conflict. In the alternate timeline, the Soviet Union would have used China as a proxy to help win the war with tactical numbers alone. Moving into the 1970s, here are some statistics that highlight the differences between the alternate timeline and our timeline. Communist reunification of Germany. In our timeline, Germany remained divided until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. In the alternate timeline, the Soviet Union would have facilitated a communist reunification of Germany, resulting in the creation of a new socialist state. Global power dynamics. In our timeline, the U.S. remained the dominant superpower while the Soviet Union eventually collapsed due to internal and external pressures. In the alternate timeline, the Soviet Union would have maintained its dominance over the world stage, leading to significant changes in global power dynamics. Third world uprisings. In our timeline, third world countries experienced a range of political, economic, and social challenges, including poverty, inequality, and corruption. In the alternate timeline, these challenges would have led to communist uprisings in many countries, further fueling the rise of leftist movements around the world. In conclusion, the alternate timeline where the Soviet Union won the Cold War would have led to significant differences in economic, political, and social factors compared to our timeline. These differences would have had far-reaching implications for global power dynamics in the course of history.
Hello fellow viewer, if you enjoy watching this video and learned something new, then consider subscribing to the channel for more history information. I'll see you in the other side, friend.